New nuclear power plants are to be built across England and Wales as the government tears up archaic planning rules. Mini power stations known as small modular reactors are to be built for the first time ever in the UK, Sir Keir Starmer announced. The Prime Minister said he was changing the rules to back the builders of this nation, and saying no to the blockers who have strangled our chances of cheaper energy, growth and jobs for far too long. And Energy Secretary Ed Miliband said, "Build, build, build. That is what Britain's clean energy mission is all about." The last nuclear power station opened in the UK was Sizewell in Suffolk, which began operating in 1995. The new nuclear stations, which Labour says will create thousands of highly skilled jobs, will be built close to sites where electricity is needed, such as data centres used to power AI technology. While nuclear power has traditionally been opposed by environmental campaigners, Mr. Miliband sees it as a vital part of plans to create a new era of clean electricity because it does not cause the carbon emissions linked to global warming in the same way as traditional fossil fuels. But industry bosses fear a massive backlash over plans to build 1,000 kilometers of new power lines linked by pylons, which are required under Labour's plan to transform the nation's energy network by 2030. They have called on the government to launch a publicity campaign to convince people that pylons will actually make their lives better. The alarm was raised by Charles Wood, Deputy Director of trade body Energy UK, which represents National Grid Electricity Transmission, owner of the high-voltage electricity network, as well as energy suppliers. He said there was a real challenge winning support and warned, "We have to get across to consumers why we are building all this infrastructure and what it means for them as a person. There are some real challenges there with getting consumers on board and getting right down to the local level when it comes to engaging communities ahead of building any new infrastructure." Mr. Wood called for a campaign to win over the public, saying, "I believe in the 1960s there was a campaign of a similar type talking about pylons being built and trying to get the public on board with it. That is the first element I would look at." And he told MPs there should be a holistic engagement with the public to give them the understanding that it is not just about building new pylons, it is about making sure that we have enough electricity to meet our needs in future. He said the UK is set to have 400,000 public electric vehicle charge points, millions of private charge points in businesses and homes, and 5 million homes with a heat pump by 2030, up to 15 million by 2035, massively increasing demand for electricity. New laws introduced by the government as part of the Planning and Infrastructure Bill are designed to speed up the planning process and prevent local objections blocking schemes. A paper by the Department for Energy Security and Net Zero warned, to connect new generation and meet future demand, around twice as much new transmission network infrastructure will be needed in Great Britain by 2030 as has been delivered in the past decade. The government aims to double the amount of electricity generated by onshore wind farms by 2030, while the amount produced by solar energy must be tripled. Scotland and Wales have been identified as prime locations for new wind farms, while solar power stations are due to be built in the southwest. Here is a summary of internet users' reactions. Finally, Labour are doing something I agree with. If this is true, it'll give credit where credit is due, generate power here, so we don't have to rely on foreign powers, who can hold us to ransom. Green energy actually started many years ago with nuclear waste being the central issue. We couldn't build them because they didn't know where to dispose of the waste. Instead we used gas and oil whose waste is actually feeding the plants and trees. With these career complainers, if you get rid of one thing, they'll moan about another. Not wrong with gas, not wrong with our oil, not wrong with our quality smokeless coal, not wrong with nuclear energy, but why don't we use our own instead of having to buy it all in and claim we are net zero? The real answer is hydroelectric power stations in our river estuaries. It's a no-brainer. Large initial outlay but years of low-cost electricity. Severn River alone could produce enough power for SW of England. Environmentalists would object because of migrating fish. But look at the River Dart, which has several weirs that have fish channels to allow fish to pass up and down river. Good, about time too. But these will take years to come online, and in the meantime we need our own source of energy, so remove the block on sourcing new sources of fossil fuels, especially gas, in the North Sea. The problem is simple. The lights are already starting to go out. We need to build fast, and gas is the only way to achieve this quickly. Nuclear takes too long. We need at least 60 gas turbines to provide the needed energy, or a much lower amount if we reduce the predicted demand, and get rid of EVs and heat pumps. Renewables have been an expensive mistake, driven by the climate change scam, and blamed on essential gas for life and food production CO2. However, over the next decade, over half of the existing renewables need to be replaced, which will limit the expansion of renewables. A doubling of energy requirements will require an increase to grid capacity, which will take 15 to 20 years, so missing the 2030 milepost for the doubling of energy. CO2 account for 0.042% of air, or 420 parts per million. It's not a pollutant or a greenhouse gas at this concentration. 97%, 0.0407% of air or 407 parts per million, of all CO2 occurs naturally, which we can do nothing about, unless we can control the sun. The rest is man-made 3%, 0.0013% of air or 13 parts per million. CO2 levels have risen from pre-industrial at 280 parts per million to 420 parts per million currently. However, man-made CO2 has risen from 8 parts per million to 13 parts per million, or 5 parts per million, over the last 175 years. CO2 stops being a GHG at 100 parts per million, as like most gases, becomes saturated by heat, and just passes any more heat through. Laws of physics. Even if all CO2, 420 parts per million, was a GHG, it would have at best a 3.5% impact on temperatures. However, man-made CO2 is only 13 parts per million, and as the IPCC state, that only man-made climate change exists. How does the 13 parts per million stop the other 999,987 parts per million from dissipating heat out into space? It would be interesting to know what caused climate change pre-industrial, as we are led to believe that man-made climate change has only existed for 175 years. Net zero is a scam. This is the moment to seize control of this additional nuclear power generation and link it to the sovereign wealth fund in ownership. It is also perfectly possible to insist on the contract being awarded to a British contractor. For those worried about the new national grid plans, this is a way of localizing power generation and distribution, saving billions if strategically placed around the UK and in sufficient numbers. Great idea. Nuclear power properly managed is safe and better for the environment. We should have done this years ago, while we were waited for renewable technology to advance. The quicker we move away from fossil fuel electricity production, the quicker we move away from international gas prices. The North Sea oil fields are owned by international companies who sell oil and gas at international prices. Our bills won't reduce until we've broken the link with international gas prices. Something global fossil fuel companies don't tell you about are the subsidies they need for operation. In 2022, these subsidies amounted to $7 trillion. Last night here in France I got an email from EDF. It announced a 16.5% reduction in charges. How can they do that when in the UK bills are going up all the time? Because France has a regulated part state-owned power system and they are net exporters of energy. What is the point of building modern nuclear generation, if National Grid are going to connect them with 100-year-old pylon construction? How many people know that a pylon route means a swathe of destruction across the country, with thousands of trees cut down and miles of hedgerow grubbed out to build Hall Road? Modern, high-voltage direct current, HVDC, cables can be buried underground with much less destruction and at lower lifetime costs, yet National Grid want to inflict pylons on us. Wind accounted for 29.4% of the UK's electricity generation mix in 2023, only a slightly smaller proportion than that accounted for by gas, 32%. For context, wind made up 26.8% of the generation mix in 2022 while gas accounted for 38.5%. The quicker we move away from fossil fuel electricity production, the quicker we move away from international gas prices. Only then will our energy bills reduce.